Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we do appreciate that last courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And for those watching online now and in the future, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we post this program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference as well. Leading our discussion today is Hella Dale, who serves as a Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy in our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. She focuses on the U.S. government institutions and programs for strategic outreach to the public of foreign countries. She began her career in journalism, working both domestic and foreign publications. For 2 decades now, she has written a weekly foreign affairs column that appears on the op-ed pages of newspapers throughout the United States. She has also traveled widely in Central and Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, and Asia. Please join me in welcoming Hella Dale. Hella?
Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. We have a very important program for you here today. Recent revelations of the Russian purchase of Facebook ads and the Russian use of Twitter accounts to undermine the American electoral system in our last election are classic examples of Kremlin information warfare. Americans today, in this election cycle, have been reminded that while the Soviet Union is long gone, its disinformation strategies are alive and well. It is a challenge that we here in the United States have to face head-on. In the countries along Russia's borders, as well as in Europe, the brunt of the Kremlin's information strategies have been felt for years. Today we have a great panel of experts with extensive first-hand experience of Russian disinformation and strategy, which they will share with us. So without further ado, we're going to get to their testimonials because there's a lot to be said and some have other meetings to move on to, but we are extremely fortunate to have a really distinguished panel. Our first speaker will be the Ambassador of the Republic of Moldova, Aureliu Chokoi. Our second speaker will be Arnoldas Pigzirnis from Lithuania. He is an advisor to the Prime Minister and also a World Affairs Transatlantic Fellow. Our next speaker will be Anna Korbut. She is also a World Affairs Transatlantic Fellow and Deputy Editor of the Ukrainian Week. And our final speaker will be Olev Snickers, who is World Affairs Transatlantic Fellow and a Visiting Fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. And he hails from Latvia. So we have 4 very important countries represented here, all of whom are on the front lines of Russian information warfare. Without further ado, Ambassador, I will turn it over to you. I'm asking each of our participants to speak for about 10 minutes. I'm sure there's a day's worth of commentary in here, but we'll try to keep it to the lunch hour. So.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Dale. Should I stay here or go to?
You may do whatever makes you more comfortable.
Perfect. I feel myself more comfortable here.
Please do.
Well, thank you very much, and indeed, I highly appreciate this beautiful opportunity to have a dialogue, to have a discussion, and let me to thank you very much, especially Heritage Foundation, for giving us this opportunity to have a dialogue and to bring into discussion this very important issue. Well, when I talk about the media landscape being deeply influenced by Russian Federation in so-called news abroad, from the point of view of Moscow, Moldova, Ukraine, as well as Baltic states are one of the target countries of that very policy of Kremlin. Main goal being to destabilize as much as possible these societies. Firstly, to reduce again, as much as possible, the confidence on governments, on administration, to create chaos in informational landscape. In my case, I'm talking about my country, Republic of Moldova, and allow me to bring just few examples. As you probably know, since our independence, 1991, in the eastern part of the Republic of Moldova remains a so-called operative group of Russian troops, which are continuing to stay in my country completely illegally. There are around 600 Russian soldiers which are still there, officially by Moscow being mandated to keep the huge amount of ammunition being storage in the eastern part of the Republic of Moldova. So, and after 27 years, this summer, my government decides to raise this question on the General Assembly of United Nations, asking UN to put on the agenda the question of withdrawing, attention, foreign troops from Republic of Moldova. The word Russian was never said. How was the reaction of Russian Federation? They started immediately to contact the international partners from the international community, saying that the Republic of Moldova is trying to push out from the Republic of Moldova so-called peacekeepers, which is completely different story. And indeed, in the international arena, when somebody is trying to push up peacekeepers, it sounds not very lucky. But this is exactly the manner how Russian propaganda machinery is acting. And while from 1,600 soldiers, foreign soldiers in the Republic of Moldova, just 800 are peacekeepers, and the rest of 600 to 800 is these exactly illegally staying till nowadays in the Republic of Moldova, Russian militaries, Russian troops, which we are trying to convince them finally to withdraw, to convince Russia Federation to withdraw these very troops from Republic of Moldova, together with more than 21,000 ton of ammunitions, Russian ammunitions, which is still in my country. Another example is very, very voiceful in this respect, especially during the last parliamentary election campaign in Ukraine. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Mr. Klimkin, came to Moldova for election run with Ukrainian minorities in the Republic of Moldova, and as an example how deep the Russian propaganda can wash the brains around its border. The Ukrainian minority in the Republic of Moldova, during the meeting with the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Mr. Klimkin, they were absolutely convinced that he is representing Nazi authorities. And Mr. Klimkin was shocked seeing how his co-nationals from Moldova are treating the things being developed in Ukraine. It was exactly the goal of Russian propaganda to make a more confidence in the fact that the new government in Ukraine after Maidan revolution is not a democratic one, but is completely anti-popular, being lighted as pro-fascist, pro-Nazist, and so on and so forth. And Mr. Klimkin told to my colleagues that very day, saying that it's amazing how Russian propaganda in such a short period can wash the brains of the goal part of key part of population. Doesn't matter where, it might be Moldova, or it might be Spain with the Catalonian issue, or it might be any other country around the world, because you very well know that Russia works a lot of so-called troll farms. The famous of them is situated in Olgino, in the city next to Moscow, where they're being paid for their comments on the social media, on the comments on different articles, on political issues around the world, and on the main goal countries. And the last example is a Facebook issue here in the United States. So the Russian Federation, they're using in the media landscape all tools which they can use, and they're using very smart, even the democratic institutions and democratic tools, which is a very dangerous. And the single, if you will ask me how we can combat such aggressive behavior of Russian trolls towards our media landscapes, the single possibility is to stop penetrating Russian disinformation machinery in our countries. That's why in this summer, Moldovan parliament decides to bring on table a new draft law which will regulate such influence of foreign channels, TV channels, and other informational channels in Moldovan informational landscape, prohibiting the transmission of not TV channels, but the military and political shows. Because I don't know how many from you are following some shows, such kind of shows on Russian television. It's very interesting. I will highly recommend you to have such experience. Because it's almost 60 minutes of crying on microphones about how bad is to live in Ukraine, or how bad is to go to European Union, and European Union is mostly on collapsing, and the single safe place in this world is Russian Federation, and no any other alternatives. It's really very interesting. That's the goal of this draft law, which is should be discussed in this session in Moldovan Parliament, is to prohibit the retransmission of such kind of shows, political shows and military discussions, which is indeed 100% definitely propaganda machinery oriented not only for home audience in Russian Federation, but mostly for so-called nearest abroad, where Moldova is situated. It might be one of the tools. Secondary, Russian Federation has not ratified the European Convention of Transfrontier Television, which regulates very well such kind of activities. That's why, yes, that's why in our draft law is quite clear indicated that we can cooperate freely with those countries which are part to this European Convention of Transfrontier Television, and being very cautious about admitting the informational material from countries which are not part of this international framework, which means that in this case, under these circumstances, for us will be a much more likely and legally basis to make such kind of stopping the entering to Republic of Moldova of disinformation from the side of Russian Federation. Well, and we can discuss about this issue weeks, perhaps months. It's a lot of things, starting from using by Russians so-called useful idiots all around the world, giving their interviews with them, as well as Russian TV channels, as well as branches of TV channels abroad, such as Russia Today, for example, or Sputnik, internet provider. Just a small example from France. If you remember, a couple of months ago, at the beginning of this year, in France, before presidential election, was a huge amount of protest movement against modification of labor laws in France. Mm-hmm. And I remember well a reportage given, showed by Russian TV. It was Russia 24. If I remember well, when one of the participants of this rally in Paris said something in French language on micro, and the translation was completely different of what is originally being said. And the translation says that, well, how We are so concerned about our life in Europe. The France has nothing more to do in Europe, and we have to think that we have to leave European Union, and it will be much better for our kids, for the laborers here in France, and so on and so forth. And thanks to our French colleagues, they started to analyze this report from Paris, asking Russia 24 how you can translate in a such manner what the lady has said on microphone, because she told about completely different issues, commenting on that very draft amendments to the labor law in France. That is another example how they manipulating the public opinion and preparing the basis for what they needed, namely to disturb the civil society, namely to promote their own interests and to put in the mentality of the people in that or another country that they have to believe in what Moscow mostly saying instead of believing their own government, their own authorities. And that is a very risky trick used by Russian Federation. Well, I will stop here because, as I said, we can discuss months about this story. And please, I have to say sorry for my colleagues that I have taken so many time in talking to you about what is with Russian media influence in Republic of Moldova. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those very interesting and disturbing comments. Arnoldas, over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here, and I guess I'll just start from the point where the ambassador finished. The fake news and Facebook ads, that's only a minor part of the tools that Russia uses. And what we see in the recent times, that's the use of cyber attacks and fake news in complex. We see various schemes of corruption, illegal, shady financing schemes for various radicals, whether that would be in France or even in the US. And that's the tactics that they are ready to use by all means, And just yesterday we went to an event in Georgetown University, and we had a really interesting story happening. The event was about Zapad exercises 2017. We were going through the information, what was happening there. And suddenly a dear journalist, so-called journalist from Riga, stood up and asked a question. I was visiting Latvia just before Zapad. I was by the border, 3 kilometers from Russian border. And I was talking to the people, and they said that we are not afraid of Russia. And that means that's only the politicians of the Baltic states were making all the hysteria, all the noise about Zapad. And let's look, Russia didn't occupy. That's true. Thank you for that. But basically, the question was that most probably the hysteria is useful only for the budgets of the Baltic states of defense. And happily, in the hall, we had a colleague from Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And after the event, he went to talk to the dear journalist from Riga, and he had his issues with Latvian language. So just to start with, I would like to say hello to anyone from Russian embassy that is here or watching us online. And if you have the notes, we'll be happy if you could share them. But that's the tactics that we use in all the events around Washington, Brussels, and wherever. So we have to be really careful in the questions that we hear and the discussions that we have. And I guess the main objective of Russian Federation is to dominate in all possible fields, whether that's cyber, whether that's fake news or discussions. And we shouldn't be focused on the small details how to combat fake news. Most probably that's like going after the kite. You are just following it and trying to say, no, that was not true. We have to give the facts the way we can, but most important is to have a communication between partners, to have communication and open communication about the things that are happening. And we have no other tool. And to my mind, I can slightly object to the ambassador that Russia is successful in the bordering regions. I would say that bordering regions, we do have a certain level of resilience due to the high investments from Russian Federation to trying to ensure us that we live really badly in our own countries. But we see the cases like you mentioned, the Catalan case. They are trying to construct a case and having many different narratives in it. And just yesterday, I sat down and looked through the narratives that we use. Last week there were three major Twitter and media bots discovered in the Catalan case. One of them was so-called Lithuanian one, and another one was another two were the Estonian ones. And apparently we were pushing for the narrative that the Catalan independence movement is very similar to the Baltics independence movement, and that there's a high support from the Baltic states to the so-called referendum for independence. And if you would look, yeah, that could be possible thing if the persons named would exist, but they are not. Well, we are really productive on Twitter and on various media sites. And the narrative has two angles. One thing is ensuring the radicalized part of Catalans, that we have certain support and have an ideological basis rooted in 1990s in the independence movement of the Baltic states. And on the other hand, is trying to have certain negative relationship between the Baltic states and the Spanish authorities. So having the inner house within NATO, within EU. So a small example, on 2013, September 11, we organized a Catalan route. We were standing hand in hand, just like the Baltic way. And the use of symbolics, they go all over. And this pattern is being used really highly. And here, of course, in Catalan case, we have the active support by Russian heroes like Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, who are true human rights defenders. And let's say we see that the best defender of human rights is the Kremlin. And we do see that dual-faced rhetorics all over, especially in United Nations from Russia's side. We will be the first ones to defend human rights in the US, in the EU, but journalists killed in the streets of Moscow or dissidents killed in the streets of Moscow, that's just minor casualties of criminals in Russia. That's it. So we do see the refocusing towards the Western states from Russia's side, as we do notice that the propaganda used in the Eastern European countries is not that effective. And we do see that on Russia Today, we do see that on Sputnik, and especially we do see that on social media. And in the following years, we'll have even more of that, as the technology of intelligent bots will be going further, and surely it will be really complicated to differ whether that's true people that are writing and commenting, or that's simply the mechanism that does it. And just trying to sum up, on the one hand, Russia really reminds me of 1984 by George Orwell, the parallel reality that we have there, and the willingness to implement that reality in all the countries, and to create distrust, to create a chaos among partners, among allies, and that they play well in the ground where they have no rules. And if that would be a boxing match, most probably the Russian side would just bring a revolver to it and say that that was our revolver that we gave them. So we can't punch in the same way, but the only tool that we have is strengthening the journalist community, having more trust in media, and working from the government side, just working with the media and strengthening their authorities, their internet authorities.
Thank you so much. Anna, you're next.
Thank you. I'm a journalist from Ukraine, and I will probably focus on a specific example, like practical example of how the propaganda or disinformation helped by the Russians has been working in Ukraine recently. Before the Maidan started, or during the Maidan and at the beginning of war, Ukrainians were often portrayed as fascists, as the government was portrayed as junta, illegitimate. Subsequently, that rhetoric changed because it stopped to be as effective, at least with the people who realized what was going on. Like the recognition of what was going on, of the reality, was taking place both in Ukraine and abroad. So in about 2015, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we started noticing a lot of calls for what you call Maidan 3. So you had a lot of accounts, especially on Facebook, where a lot of Ukrainians, politically active and engaged Ukrainians, are active. I think for you it would be Twitter, but for us it was Facebook, where it was like a community where everybody was discussing politics. Even politicians have accounts, active accounts, and communicate with the audience through Facebook. So we started having these weird, to us journalists, weird accounts with very patriotic, with perfectly Ukrainian names like Stepan Mazur. You can't think it's a Russian or any other name. It's a Ukrainian name. On the picture, they would have not a portrait of a person, but mostly a man in fatigue. So you could think it's a soldier from the ATO, from the army, or it would be a Ukrainian flag. They would be promoting and administering groups like Patriots of Ukraine, or everybody, let's go and fight against corruption of the government. The posts you would have there were partly based on reality. So what they would do is share links to real stories and real critical stories, news from the media. A lot of media in Ukraine are very critical about the government, including probably mine. But we criticize the government constructively. So we criticize the government because we want it to do the right things, not the wrong things. We do not want to topple the government, and in a revolutionary way. Because a lot of people do realize that we are in a very dangerous position where if we're unhappy with the government, we can protest against it, but then it could be used by external forces to threaten our stability as the state. In those groups, in those accounts, they were growing in number exponentially. You would have very emotional, very charged calls for Maidan 3, topple Poroshenko, saying that Ukrainians are so smart, educated, and hardworking, but the government, the elites, are so corrupt and so rotten, so we have to get rid of them. And the veterans from the war will come back from the front line and will help us because they have combat experience, they have arms. And so it will no longer be a peaceful revolution like in the Maidan initially, but it will be like, we'll get rid of that once and for all. The journalists started looking into those groups and those accounts. And they would, in the case of the Stepan Mazur, who was very active, he was making like 20 posts per day, which for anyone in the audience, what do you make, like 2-3 posts, original posts? If you want to write an article or analyze something said, you have to research, you have to spend time. You can't write 20 posts. I mean, you can't share 100 links. He was doing that account was doing that. And so the journalists started looking into those accounts through various investigations, including from some help from IT people, from hackers. They would find that such accounts were often administered from St. Petersburg or Vnukovo. Not necessarily was it just one person that was administering it. It just could be a couple of people who were administering, filling the content, engaging new accounts, and doing all that. That wave, myself, for my Facebook, I don't add friends that I first, before adding friends, I look at their profile. So when I see that they share all these hysterical news or hysterical calls for, topple the government or stuff like that, and just spreading this unhappiness with what's going on, anything that's going on, whether it's wrong actions of the government, whether it's painful reforms or anything like that. So I checked the accounts of people who tried to add me as friend. But then I saw that I was added without my knowledge into various groups, and I would see these calls to revolution and topple the government 2-3 times a day, even though I was cleaning up my feed. The thing is that my Facebook community is quite critical in terms of consumption of information. So I have journalists, I have politicians among my friends who first check the information before sharing it or reading it, and they can block the bots, or they can block the trolls or people who share it indiscriminately. But I wanted to see how just the average audience reacted to it. And so I have some family members or friends who are not journalists, who live in provincial towns. And you could definitely see that they were sharing a lot more of those links and reacting to them, by contrast to the links from mainstream media. So for instance, if you had a serious analytical article, a long read analyzing all that was said in those hysterical comments, they wouldn't share that. They would hardly read that. But the clickable headlines they would share. They would get emotionally charged. And then when you go back home, you can feel it in the rhetoric, how people speak, and they don't have really reasonable arguments. They are emotionally charged, and they often refer to various disinformation. It's not really fake news anymore. It's just this manipulation of reality and twisting it and distortion. What we started doing in that situation, our journalist community, they started making infographics, visual content, and also analytical articles, like investigative articles, showing where the traces led. And mostly they were leading either to Moscow or to some Russian coordinated groups. So they were raising awareness of people in terms of telling people you cannot just read a clickable headline and share it and believe it. You have to check your sources. Better spend time and invest your efforts, invest your energy, and get better information, because in the end it hurts you as a patriot of Ukraine, and it hurts Ukraine. That has helped, I would say. But now we see kind of a new line of this information hype going on. And I would summarize it as the EU is getting tired of Ukraine, the West is getting tired of Ukraine, Ukraine is getting tired of the EU getting tired of it. So let's topple the government and elect a better government and all that. And we have elections in 2019, so the scheduled elections. So I think it will only intensify. If I may add one other consequence, so even for people who are not prone to these information baits, for instance, you have a person who has a lot of following, a big following, and he or she is an opinion leader. So mostly they speak out on important topics that are often controversial. And a lot of people, average users, don't have an opinion on those topics. They follow the opinions of those people that resonate with them. So you can present your opinion in a very emotional, hysterical way. You can present your opinion in a reasonable way, and people will follow it. People will like it. What we often observe in the comments is that we have a lot of bots or troll accounts who add hysterical and hateful comments. And in the end, you end up with maybe reasonable post on a controversial issue, but the feed is full of hateful comments, and it charges those who were feeling negative about it but could change their mind, those who were feeling emotionally charged about it but could be calmed down by the adequate analysis in the post. they see the comments, they get charged, and in the end you have like a storm of hate, not a discussion, but a quarrel, a war, the war of words, and no really reasonable discussion, no adequate discussion among people. So, and that could also hamper the speakers, the opinion leaders, from expressing their mind. It could make the journalists and opinion leaders and just people who can adequately analyze information to say, okay, I'm gonna stay quiet. I'm gonna stay low in this case because, yeah. Yeah, that's our one of our many practical cases.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those first-hand details there. And Olaf's.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming and for your interest into the topic. So before I give you certain facts and figures and situations on the Latvia, I would like to add some slightly scholarly dimension view on the topic. So basically, the first thing I would mention is that Latvia still lives in a strictly divided informational space, practically having a two-community society, and whose policies of integration cannot be assessed as success story yet. So discussion in broader sense, in my opinion, refers to the term of societal security, how groups, state, and society forms it. Here we are having kind of social security dilemma, which translated from the classical security dilemma also rests on misperception. Let's have that perspective. So certain activities from the side of the one group in society, if ill perceived, might be understood as threatening to other and vice versa. And we do not take into consideration foreign impact yet. But the worrisome fact is that there are 37% of those living in Latvia what use Russian language as the main language in their families. And we our giant neighbor, which is Russia country besides our borders. So here are some questions you might ask in this context. And these questions, of course, are being asked by our scholars too. Why Russian-speaking community is immune to the Latvian information space? Why they tend towards self-exclusion instead of inclusion? How they rate themselves to Latvia? We might assume the large scale in which Russia's propaganda and role of disinformation campaigns influence display. I will give you two more figures. After Crimea crisis in 2014, 63.8% of Russian speakers considered themselves as Latvian patriots, and 58% of those who were citizens were proud of it. These are very promising figures. But at the same time, according to the social surveys of the same year, the most popular news source for Russian speakers still are Moscow-controlled television, which is Первый Балтийский канал, First Baltic Channel, holding up to like 48% of the total share. So let me tell you about findings of very interesting study which was conducted by Latvian and Ukrainian scholars, and which refers to the Stratcom of NATO Stratcom which is based in Riga, and called Stratcom Laughs in Search of an Analytical Framework. The study concluded that the part of its soft power toolkit, Russia utilizes humor to undermine the credibility of Western political leaders. The Kremlin hijacked media broadcasting into the Baltic states explicitly taps into local Russian speakers in their shared memories, experiences, and emotional attachment to the Soviet past. Moreover, this proportion of those who born in the Soviet era and who are now in their mid-late 30s and older, regardless of their ethnic origin and political preference, make up about 75% of Latvia's population. So they all might be target of the Russians' media influence in Latvia, not only Russian speakers. Notably, Russian television programs, which were mentioned in the broadcasts, present anti-Western values by portraying private property as something immoral. Russian TV also avoids assigning any value to individuals over the group or the state. So the outside world, in that perspective, is hostile and not to be trusted. And as there was mentioned, Russia is portrayed as the fortress surrounded by hostile forces whose influence must be resisted. So the study concludes that Russian TV entertainment and its beaming into the Baltics is designed in part to help preserve those populations' Soviet-era mentality. And this is a thing which should be taken into consideration pretty much. So what actions were taken in Latvia against Russian disinformation so far? So since 2014, our authorities 2 times banned transmission of Russian television and cancelled also registration of Sputnik News, which happened last year. Estonia, as my Estonian colleague is not present here, I can speak from them too as a little. Estonia introduced its own Russian language TV broadcasts in September 2015, and they launched ETV Plus, providing alternative to the propaganda-driven, Kremlin-controlled Russian TV stations. Latvia has also learned to respond to information operations and cyber attacks. For example, we have strengthened our cyber defense unit of the National Guard and established CRT.lv, an administrative body charged with securing the country's informational technologies. But still, in case of Latvia, even a state media coverage over all Latvian territory is incomplete. The quality of Latvian TV broadcasting in Russian could also be improved to help shift Latvian Russian speakers' attention away from Moscow's TV channels. Idea to have separate channel in Russian language in Latvia was opposed by certain political groups as they considered that action could be demotivating factor for Latvian Russian speakers to learn Latvian language and successfully integrate. This argument could be we can discuss, but that is why they rejected that idea. In turn, Latvian telecommunications company Lattelecom increased their English and Russian language news offerings, including TV channel Dozhd and Ukrainian Russian channel Espresso in Latvia. So what should be done to make the situation better? First, I think task for the state should be to enable citizens to make more informed decisions based on critical analysis and comparison. I agree with those who propose inclusion of media literacy subject in the school curriculum, which would benefit to this goal. To counter Russia's soft power and information attacks, Latvia must focus on its own internal strategic communication. Specifically, Latvian government needs to do a better job explaining its policies and actions to all members of society and do not ignore its Russian-speaking community. Latvia should promote journalistic competence, as said by Arnoldas, in matters related to security and not only. Ignoring the Russian-speaking community can deepen social fragmentation and facilitate potential Russian military operations or any kinds of hybrid activities in Latvia. Ukraine, in many ways, succeeded countering Russia's humor and by launching its own law of offensive. Probably the Baltic governments and non-governmental organizations should choose more proactive than reactive strategies. Should we consider joint Baltic countries' efforts countering Russia's propaganda? In general terms, Russian channels are directed towards Russian-speaking audiences regardless of their belonging to particular Baltic state. Should be regional media in Russian language created along with national ones, simultaneously covering audiences in all the 3 Baltic states? Also, strengthening other social structures as NGOs should also be in our focus. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could take the liberty of asking you the first question, and it is a little bit sort of introspective in Washington terms. Over the past couple of years, the U.S. government has made various efforts to counter the Russian information warfare strategies, and one of them has been creating Russian language programming directed at the populations of Russian speakers in countries like yours along the Russian borders. Is there any awareness of these efforts? Have they been met with any success? Are people listening? Are they viewing? What is your experience?
If we would look from historical perspective, that showed that it really worked. Currently, there's a question of what finances and what accents do we put in it. And to what we see countering Russia's effort and countering Russia's finances pushed towards that, that's quite impossible. To a certain extent, we are doomed to fail as we do not spread information directly. We do that through pop culture. We do that through all these pop sources, TV series, films. And a small example from Lithuania. There's time from time in our cinemas you would get a new Russian movie, the new generation Russian movie. Usually they would not put in an accent that's made in Russia. But next to that, it's very common that that's based on historical events, and usually from a very clear perspective of Russian Federation. And in the last three films that we have faced, we were directed at school communities as well. So the distributor that gets huge discounts for distributing that movie was offering schools tickets free of charge, just to go through a new narrative of Second World War, and to see that actually Baltic states were liberated by the Great Red Army. So countering such effort, that's not easy. And also looking at our media sources. If you the purchase of one TV series, if you would do that from a US source, that would be around 3,000 to 5,000 euros per series. On Russia's side, that would cost around 100 euros. More or less, the next step that they could make, they could just pay you for showing it. So basically, they play under other rules. They play under different conditions, and they do it through a pop culture.
I actually those efforts are noticeable. We have a new kind of TV channel, but I think it's a multimedia channel. It's called Настоящее время, and it's aimed at reaching out to the Russian speakers and providing accurate information, but also good content, attractive content. One of my concerns is that a lot of Russian speakers, or this target audience that succumbs to Russian propaganda, it doesn't really. First of all, it isolates itself, because when it sees that somebody criticizes Russia, they don't want to listen to that. They don't want to hear or see that. It's propaganda sponsored by the United States, most likely. So they are not trustful about this information. Second of all, they're very prone to various conspiracy theories. And for instance, even before 2014, in Eastern Ukraine, we had loads of fiction books, like detective stories and stuff like that, with covers, Donbass liberated by the Russians from the CIA or something. or NATO, the Russia, or the militias fighting against American-backed Ukrainian fascists in the Donbass. So that those were detectives or novels or like pop literature being pumped into the minds. And so how do you counter that? With your own conspiracies, with penetrating that mindset and kind of undermining it with truthful facts which people are distrustful of. And yes, what Arnolda says is quite important. I mean, we have a lot of Russian pop product, be it music, books, films, about celebrating Russian lifestyle and the way Russians are positioned towards their state, so loyal and obedient in a way, and a lot of negative content about the West. It can be subtle. It doesn't have to be like it can be very subtle, but it works, and so it would make sense to make more popular product rather than focusing on delivering news and information, which is, to be honest, plenty of good information and news in the Russian language if you want to hear that. If you don't,
So yes, we are. I want to stress that we are really lacking that the genuine channel in Russian language, which should be provided by the Latvian state in order to, as much as possible, to detach this massive attention of the Russian speakers towards the Moscow-controlled media. And it's so important in the situation when really we are really living in very divided and separate informational spaces in Russian informational space and in Latvian informational space. So all the efforts which might to detach these Russian speakers from all these fake news, getting them on more objective resources of information as much as possible would help very much. But situation is not very promising at this stage. As I mentioned, the PBK channel is still the most popular among the Russian speakers in Latvia, and not a good news so far.
Challenge to be sure. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. We have a roving microphone, and we have a question here in the middle. You can identify yourself by name and affiliation, please.
Sure. My name is Ron Neering. I served as presidential campaign spokesman for Senator Ted Cruz in 2016. My interest in this topic flows from the fact that whenever my job would be to appear on cable news up to 5 times a day on behalf of my candidate. And my interest in this emanated from the fact that whenever I would step off a television interview, if I had said something critical about Marco Rubio or John Kasich or Ben Carson, there was no response on Twitter whatsoever, dead. However, if I was critical of Donald Trump, I would get a torrent of negative comments on Twitter. And then if I took a look at the accounts, if I took a look at the profile picture and the number of tweets and so on and so forth, there was a very, very similar pattern. No personal identifiable profile photo, no geographic location listed. The tone was always extremely hysterical, not something that I would see from typical conservative activists and the like. And I don't think this has anything to do with one candidate or another in terms of the outcome of the election or anything like that. But my concern is that so my question is, number one, is this consistent with what we have seen from Russia propaganda efforts through social media in Eastern Europe? That's number one. And number two, it might be my party that's targeted next time. And so what advice would you have to help to insulate our activist base in the conservative movement, which has been manipulated by this type of propaganda effort, to help to insulate them in the future so that they can make decisions and judgments based upon genuine American issues as opposed to being manipulated in this manner.
I don't know if any of you want to take a stab at this. If we look at it as an example of, I suppose, Russian troll activity.
Yeah, I guess what's important from that side is what Russia is willing is to see the question of the US elections and their possible interference is politicized, so that each group would take radical positions. The supporters of current president would say that didn't happen, and the others would say that happened, and that happened in respect of the president. And that could easily be done without any knowledge of a campaign. And we can choose whomever we want to support in that sense, and we might see a completely different situation, as you told, in the next elections. But the interesting point there, and I had a question last week, how does it differ the situation in Germany, at current German elections? We were trying to do that there as well. And from my personal point of view, the major issue that was seen in the US election was the so-called breaking news effect. So anything that went scandalous or any possible so-called leaks, they were immediately taken by the media. And just before the German elections, I met with our colleagues in German Chancellery in the public affairs part. And actually, we were working with the media and trying to explain the methods so that the media would control and double check what is happening and how they are being played with in that sense. And I guess that's really useful in that sense. That's why, and from our respect in Lithuania, we are attaching public information campaigns from the media side, that they would create the products themselves by analyzing the methods that the opponents use and clarifying them to the public. So that will be on the cyber side and the media information side. So basically, that helps for the journalists themselves to understand the so-called game rules from Russian side, and that helps the general public. As for the trends, they are quite similar in that sense, and as colleague told, that happened in Ukraine, and that happens with fake. The only thing that we have, the popularity of Facebook. They do it through Facebook rather than through Twitter. And maybe it's slightly more complicated to have the bots reaction on Facebook field, but generally the patterns are similar. So they can easily shift. One day they can be supporting one candidate, on the other day they can do it to the other candidate. So major goal is simply to spread chaos and general mistrust in any information that is given. They do not want you to believe that what the bots say. We only want to have a chaos and disbelief in anything you hear.
I have just one little thing to add. What we have been, not encouraging, but telling just users to do is if you see an account that spreads a lot of hateful messages or a lot of hysterical messages and has no real background to it, like one or two pictures, fake pictures, no personality behind it, just file complaints with Facebook or with, I don't know how it works on Twitter. But for instance, our opinion leaders have been very often blocked by the Russian trolls through the storm of complaints. But you can do the same thing, and it's not going to be restriction of the freedom of expression, because this is not a real person, and he or she, this is the troll. And it can be, if the more aware the audience is, you can have like a set of criteria by which you identify a troll, and you can make those criteria known to as wide audience as possible, and then you can file complaints with Facebook or Twitter to block these accounts.
So yeah, really, authorities and civil society, non-governmental sectors should be and must be more proactive, identifying these situations. And here, the media literacy is the thing which should be improved as much as possible, and delivered to members of society for them to better understand the situation, and might help them orientate in through various those venues of fake information. So thanks.
And I think that's where the congressional investigations and hearings and things like that into what happened in the last election with social media is really important.
And if we see the activity of bots, the automated response system that can provide hundreds and hundreds of posts and tweets a day, we have to understand that there's a need of dialogue with Twitter and Facebook authorities as well. It's their primary responsibility. And the initiatives led by German Bundestag to have the segments of possible fake news marked, or reactions to bots, that could be a possible form of discussion between our governments and the authorities of Facebook and Twitter. So we have to admit that these companies are more or less separate states simply on the internet space. So we have to have a clear dialogue on the ground rules that we use, especially when we have this artificial intelligence bots coming up, and we have to be ready for it.
All right, let's take one more question and then we'll be done.
I'm sorry. I wonder if there's not a
I'm sorry,
difference
could you
between.
give us
My name's Dan Lieberman. I'm a writer, and I was wondering if there's not a difference between on Twitter people just expressing themselves and influencing. I don't see where these Twitter accounts by anonymous people who are not well known have any influence. They may be expressing themselves, but who listens to them? Now, we do have a president of the United States who does use a Twitter account to influence people, engage in what people think is unfair attacks on other people, and not to mind, to certain people's awareness or knowledge, originate fake news, saying things that are not true. So I was wondering, how would you compare President Trump's use of Twitter account to influence people and what we see in other people's use of Twitter accounts, which has no influence at all?
I don't know if you have any views on that.
Well,
talk mostly about your countries.
Well, I definitely think that Donald Trump's Twitter activity has far more influence because it's kind of institutionalized, I guess, here, and there is an audience, or also an echo chamber, but an audience that that is willing to listen to it. In terms of the trolls and bots and these networks, I don't know about the United States, but in Ukraine, they do influence people, and you have to look. You're not looking at opinion leaders or politicians or journalists for that influence, although that too sometimes. But you look at just average people, as I said, my family or friends who are not very critical consumers of information, and we must keep in mind that it's the majority of population, because they have no time to look into history 250 years back and what language was banned and why, or they don't have the energy to look at what was happening to the currency 10 years ago and why the current central bank head is guilty of that. They will just respond emotionally to the post, and then that will be reflected in the way they vote, in the way they perceive the government. In Ukraine, it was reflected in, for instance, a lot of people saying this war is beneficial for both Russia but also the Ukrainian government, which is clearly not.
Well, thank you very much. And I just say that certainly all those, very highly charged emotional comments and very vitriolic comments that come out of, some people genuinely, and sometimes out of troll farms and bots. I think it has had the effect of poisoning the political discourse a great deal, and that is to the detriment of all of us. But in any event, thank you so very much for your insights into what's happening on your front. We have our own front here, and we will continue to investigate what's
common
going
one.
on. Yes. Thank you.